Hi everyone, my name's Nerrisa, big time craft enthusiast and lover of all things Bargello. For those of you who don't know what Bargello is, it's an ancient method of tapestry which had a huge resurgence in the 70s, and I'm on a one-woman mission to bring it to the modern maker. Its simple stitches mean it's great for all levels of crafter, and if you're a colour lover like me, then it's definitely the craft for you. In this video, I'm going to show you the basics of Bargello so you can get to grips with the stitches, adding colours and finishing off your canvases, all ready to get started on your first project. So let's go, shall we? Here I'm going to show you the basic Bargello stitch. As you can see, Bargello is made up of lots of single lines that are facing one direction, and if you layer them up just perfectly, then you can make yourself a quite interesting pattern. So I'm going to show you how to get started with something like this. First of all, you're going to need your thread, a pair of scissors, and a needle. Now, ordinarily you would use a size 18 needle and some tapestry thread, but for this I'm going to use a slightly bigger needle and some bigger grid just so you can see everything better. So let's get started. Now, first of all, take your thread, and you don't want to work with anything that's kind of longer than an elbow's length. So once you've got that, grab your scissors and just give it a snip. Now I'm going to show you my super handy trick for threading, because obviously with a thread like this, it comes apart quite a lot because it's made up of lots of fibres. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab a scrap piece of paper. Now it's normally really handy if you're using tapestry wool because obviously they include those, but for now I'm just going to use this. So I'm going to fold it flat, and taking my scissors, I'm just going to snip a small edge of this off, like so. You can put this piece of paper to the side, you'll only need this bit. So if I score it so it's nice and folded and then open it up, what I'm going to do is lay my thread inside, and then I'm going to fold it closed. So if you can see now, you should have that sandwiched piece of paper with thread inside of it. Then if you grab your needle, you can literally just shimmy that through the eye, and that will help you to thread it without any hassle. Next, it's time to start our first set of stitches. So when you're starting on a grid on Bargello, you start it in one particular way. Now, the front of this piece and the back look reasonably similar, and that's because we don't use knots in Bargello. There are a few reasons for that. The first being that it helps your stitches to sit flatter, and the second being that because we tend to go in and out of the same holes a lot, what we don't want to do is knock our stitches out. So by using this method, you'll avoid that. So first things first, you're going to take your needle and you're going to come up through the canvas. As you do this, remembering that there's no knots, you're going to pull it slowly because you don't want to pull it out the other side of the grid. Once you have about an inch of tail left, you're going to grab that and using your thumb and finger, hold it in place as you continue to stitch. For this pattern, I'm just going to use a count of 5. So I'm in number 1, and I'm counting 2, 3, 4, 5, and coming back down the grid. As I do that, I'm still holding this tail in place. It's a bit tricky at first, but you'll get used to it as you go. Once my stitch is in place, I'm still continuing to hold this tail, and I'm going to continue. Now for this example, I'm just going to keep stitching in straight rows, but if you were going to follow a pattern, then you might need to move up or down the grid depending on what that looked like. So once again, I'm coming up through the grid, still holding that tail in place, and then coming back down again. Now what will start to happen is that your stitches will be secure now because you're beginning to fill the grid. So you don't need to hold it as tightly, but still bear in mind what this tail underneath is doing. Your goal is to maneuver your stitches so that they eventually cover those stitches. A bit like this one, you can't see the tail. So if I keep doing this, now, as I've gotten further along in my pattern, I've not had to hold onto the tail as much, but you can see that if I now turn this over to the back, it's almost as if it's disappeared because my stitches have covered it over. And that is how you start your Bargello off. Now, you might be thinking, my thread's getting a little short. If that happens, don't worry. What you want to do is make sure that with your pattern, you don't leave it any sort of longer than about an inch. For this, again, the purposes of this, I'm just going to work with something a little bit longer, but you want to essentially ensure you can maneuver the needle. Because what you're going to do is take your piece, turn it over, and then gently thread your needle underneath those stitches, pulling it tight and thus hiding the thread underneath the stitches. Once you've done that and it's all secure, you can just snip that edge as close as you can get so it's hidden, and there you have your first row of stitches. Now, if you're anything like me, you're going to want to add a lot of colour into your patterns. So to do this is simple. All you need to do is grab your next colour, remembering you always work with an elbow's length of thread. Thread it up using the trick I showed you earlier. And once you've done that, take your piece, turn it back over, and this time, working towards where you want your next set of stitches to start, thread the needle underneath again. As you pull it, you'll notice that it will glide underneath, and when you get to the very end, just underneath, you're going to want to stop. And what you should be able to see is sort of a peak of the thread underneath, but it's not hanging out. So once again, we're going to begin stitching. So you're going to hold this tail in place with your thumb and forefinger because you don't want to pull it out as you stitch. And then you're just going to carry on as you were before. Once again, this is not a very exciting pattern, but it's just to show you. So I'm going to carry on until the end of my grid. As you can see, I'm coming to the end of my grid and I've still got enough thread to be able to maneuver my needle underneath the stitches, which is perfect. So when I get to the end, like before, I want to turn my needle this way around and then just thread it underneath the stitches. You don't need to go all the way to the end. Normally about an inch is enough. So I'm going to push that through and pull it tight. And then as you can see, there'll be some tail for me to snip. And I'm just going to do that there. So you have quite neat stitches on the grid. You can see I didn't have to pull too hard to make that tension look really great. And on the back, all of the threads are hidden, which is great because when you're working on plastic grid, it tends to be that it's for more durable products. So you can see that things will be able to quite easily slip past it without pulling any of the stitches loose. It's all nice and secure. Next, we're gonna start working up the grid. So just as a note, when it comes to Bargello, it's easier to work from left to right and then from the bottom to the top. Now, you can change this up depending on what your pattern is or whether you're left-handed or right-handed, but as a rule, try to work from one side to the other consistently and then up or down so that you don't get confused. For this purpose, I'm going to work from the bottom up, which means my next row of stitches is going to go above here. So when I'm ready to start, I'm going to take my grid again, and it's really key to remember that the set of stitches we did at the beginning where we covered over the tail, we only do that to get the Bargello started. From now on, you're going to use the method we used to add a new colour every time we want to do new stitches. The only reason we would need to use the stitching over the tail method again is if we're wanting to jump up somewhere else on the board. This is more commonly seen in more complicated patterns. Where possible, you can even jump across it without having to unthread or rethread again. So this is where it gets a little bit confusing, but you want to work towards where your next set of stitches are going to start. And because I'm working from left to right, I want that to be here. So I'm going to remember that when I turn it over by holding it like this. So now I can see I want to start my stitches on this side. So I'm going to take my needle once again and thread it under this set of stitches, pulling the tail underneath. Oh, not that tail. Pulling the tail underneath and making sure that everything is secure. As I turn it over, I'm going to hold this securely as I stitch, and we always share a square in Bargello where possible, or depending on the pattern. So I'm going to pull through this same square here, and then I'm going to start counting to 5 again. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to come back down the grid. You'll have noticed that when I stitch, I start from the bottom of each one and go back down the grid at the top. The reason for this is if you start to stitch around the pattern, it won't give you a space for you to hide your stitches underneath. So it's really key that you always start at the bottom of a stitch, or as you go up the grid, or start at the top of the grid as you go down. So for example, if I was now going to move up, I would still stitch in here and go down here. But if I wanted to start moving back down the board, I would start at the top of the stitch and come back in again. And me doing these random stitches is a great way to show you how to unpick when you go wrong. If you do go wrong, don't worry at all. It's super simple to unpick it. If it's only a few stitches, simply just take your needle off, run it underneath the stitches, and you can pull them out one by one. If you think, actually it's quite a few stitches and this is just going to ruin my wool, it's nice and simple to fix your mistakes. All you need to do is run your scissors underneath your stitches and snip, and they will come undone. You can then use your needle to drag them out, and then you can start again by taking this section out, and you're back to where you started.